The dead do not breathe. That was the first thing Aldrich learned north of the wall. Not from a Meister, not from a scroll, but from the sound of them moving through the dark. No ragged exhale, no fog of breath in frozen air. Just the crunch of snow under feet that no longer belonged to anyone, and the low, directionless moan that seemed to come from the cold itself rather than any throat. He had been running for what felt like the better part of a lifetime. There were 6 of them left. 6 from a ranging party of 19. The others had gone down in the valley 2 miles back, not fighting, not even screaming by the end, just falling under the weight of numbers that kept standing back up no matter how many times you put them down. Aldrich had a gash along his left forearm from a wight that had grabbed him through the dark fingers like iron clamps, and he had only gotten free because Harwick had driven a torch into its face and bought him 2 seconds. Harwick was not running anymore. The wildling woman beside him, she had given her name once, back at Eastwatch, but Aldrich had already lost it, was bleeding from somewhere above her ear. She ran like a person who had decided bleeding did not matter. Maybe it did not. Maybe nothing mattered except the tree line ahead and whatever came after it. Behind them, the moaning grew. He did not look back. He had learned that too. The tree line came up fast, and then they were inside it. Branches clawing at cloaks, roots snagging boots, the darkness doubling under the canopy. Someone behind him stumbled and cursed in a voice too young to be this far north. Aldrich did not stop. Stopping was dying. He heard the pursuit before he saw anything closer than it should have been, the sound of something unbothered by branches or roots or cold or any of the things that slowed the living. And underneath it, a new sound, sharper. One of the 6 going down with a noise that was not a scream exactly, but something shorter and more final. 5 then. The trees broke into an open patch of ground, and Aldrich ran 3 steps into it before he registered what was standing in the middle. A man, not a ranger, not a wildling. Just a man standing there like he had been waiting, hands loose at his sides. No weapon that Aldrich could see, no torch, no armor. He was large in a way that stopped the eye, not tall the way some men were tall, but built in a manner that seemed almost structural, as though his body had been assembled for a purpose that ordinary men were not made for. Even in the dark, even at a dead run, the breadth of his shoulders and the thickness of his neck registered as wrong. Aldrich's stomach tightened before his mind caught up with why. Not the wrong of a wight. The wrong of something alive that had no business being that still. His hair was red against the snow-reflected sky. He was not looking at the tree line. He was looking at something above it. Or perhaps at nothing at all. Aldrich pulled up short. The others nearly crashed into him. "Move!" the wildling woman snapped. "Move! The first dead man came out of the trees. What happened next was not a fight." Aldrich had been in fights. He had watched rangers who had spent decades learning to survive beyond the wall. What followed in the open ground was not that. The stranger turned when the wight was 4 feet from him, and he moved before it finished, deciding to lunge, stepping into the angle before the thing committed his right hand, coming up in a short arc that connected with the jaw at a point that did not seem to leave room for argument. The dead man's head snapped sideways. His knees folded. He went into the snow like a thing that had forgotten the purpose of legs. The wight spasmed twice and did not rise. The second came from the left. The stranger stepped into it rather than away, drove the heel of his palm into the sternum, and the crack was audible across the open ground. The dead thing folded around the impact and hit the snow 6 feet back. It twitched, tried to push itself upright, and failed. The third and fourth arrived together, and for a moment Aldrich thought this was where the math caught up. But the stranger moved between them with something that was not speed exactly, or not only speed, but a kind of spatial certainty. as if he had already mapped where everything was going to be before it arrived. He caught the third by the arm, and the arms separated at the shoulder with a sound that made the youngest ranger vomit into the snow. The fourth he struck once open-handed at the base of the neck. It dropped and lay still. The remaining three had come out of the trees by then. The wildling woman had the presence of mind that Aldrich did not. She pulled the dragon glass blade from her belt, crude chipped dark green-black in the moonlight, and drove it into the first one the stranger had brought down. The thing came apart. She moved to the second without pausing. The stranger watched her. His expression did not shift. "The dark stone," he murmured, his voice low and flat, uninterested in whether anyone heard it. "That ends them." "Yes," she said, not looking up. "That's the point." "I see." He said it the way someone said it when they were not being told something new but confirming a theory they had already formed. Then he turned back to the last three, and what followed was brief and very loud. And when it was done, there were no more of the dead standing in the open ground, and the stranger with red hair was brushing snow from his knuckles with the air of someone who had finished a task that mildly inconvenienced him. Aldrich realized he had not moved in some time. Neither had most of the others. "You need the stone to finish them," the stranger said. He was looking at the scattered remains now, with an expression that was neither satisfaction nor disgust. "Destroying the body is not enough on its own." "No," Aldrich managed. "It's not." "Useful to know." The wildling woman straightened dragon glass, still in her hand. She had the look of someone running a calculation of her own. "Who are you?" The stranger looked at her, not threatening, not welcoming. The look of something that has measured what it is seeing, and found it neither threat nor prey, which somehow was less comfortable than either of those would have been. "Where's the strongest thing in this world?" he said. Silence. Wind through the trees. Somewhere behind the tree line, nothing moved anymore. "There's an army of the dead," Aldrich said, because it seemed relevant. "Their king. South of here, there are kings." The wildling woman answered, her voice carrying the flat wariness of someone raised, knowing that kings were rarely good news. "And dragons. Wars that have been running longer than anyone can remember." She paused. "Word travels fast since the wall came down. One of the dragons is already dead. Worse than dead." The stranger considered this the way someone considers a map laid out before them. "Dragons," he said. "3. One of them is theirs now." A pause. Not the pause of someone surprised. The pause of someone slotting new information into an existing calculation. "Good," he said. He walked past them southward, out of the open ground, and into the dark beyond the trees, unhurried as though the army somewhere behind them was a detail already filed away, and the road ahead was something he had already decided about. Aldrich turned to watch him go, far to the north, far enough that it should not have been visible, but the night was clear. And the dead did not need torches. A light pulsed against the horizon. Cold and blue-white, the color of nothing, living, spreading and contracting like something breathing that had never drawn breath. The stranger did not look back at it. He did not need to. The rumors arrived 3 hours before the man did. John heard the first version from a ranger who had come in through the eastern gate just before dawn, half frozen and talking fast the way men talked when they were not sure anyone would believe them. A figure walking south from the direction of the wall. Red hair. No horse, no cloak, no visible weapon. Moving through weather that had killed 2 outriders that week without appearing to notice it. The ranger said the figure had passed within 50 yards of a white patrol, and the patrol had drifted the wrong direction entirely, as though the wind had simply carried them elsewhere. John asked him to repeat that part. The ranger repeated it and looked like he wished he had a different answer. The second version came from a wildling runner an hour later. In this telling, the figure had killed 40 whites bare-handed, eaten one of them, and was carrying a severed head as a trophy. John set that version aside but kept the core of it, bare hands moving south whites down. By the time the third account reached him, this one from a boy barely old enough to hold a spear, who said the man had walked through fire without flinching. John had stopped trying to sort truth from fear and started thinking about what to do when the source of those rumors walked through his gates. Sansa found him on the ramparts before the third hour of morning had fully turned. "You've heard," she observed. It was not a question. 3 different stories. They agree on almost nothing except the hair. She stood beside him and looked north where the dark was beginning to loosen its grip on the horizon. Her breath fogged in the cold. "What do you intend to do?" "Talk to him. Find out what he wants. And if what he wants is something we can't give him, or something we shouldn't." John did not answer immediately, because it was a good question and she knew it. Below them, the courtyard was already moving, with the pre-dawn activity of an army, preparing to outlast as siege torches being replaced. Watch rotations changing the distant clang of steel from the forge that never fully went quiet. Thousands of people depending on decisions made on walls like this one, in the dark before anyone was ready. "Then we deal with that when we know," he answered finally. Sansa made a small sound that was not agreement and not argument, and that was somehow worse than either. He came through the eastern gate at first light, and the gate guards did not stop him. John learned that 2 experienced men had looked at the figure approaching across the frost-hardened approach road and found when the moment came that neither of them had actually given the order to bar the gate. One of them later said he had thought about it. The other said he had opened his mouth to call out, and what came out instead was silence. John did not reprimand them. He understood in a way he could not have explained cleanly that there was a difference between a man who would not stop and a man you decided not to stop. This was the second kind, and the guards had read that correctly, even if they could not have said how. The stranger walked into the outer yard and stopped. John was waiting with 6 men, not a show of force, he had decided, but not alone either. Longclaw was at his hip. He had considered leaving it behind and rejected the idea less because he thought he would use it, and more because he was still himself, and this was still Winterfell. The man was enormous in a way that the rumors had somehow undersold. John had seen large men. The mountain's reputation preceded every room he had ever entered, and John had crossed paths with warriors on 3 continents who wore their size like a declaration. This was different. The breadth of the stranger's frame was not decoration and not accident. It was purpose made physical, the body of something that had been constructed layer by layer for a function that had nothing to do with comfort or ceremony. His red hair was loose in the wind. His hands were at his sides. He was scanning the yard the way a man scanned terrain he was considering moving through methodically without urgency assigning values. His eyes moved to John and stayed there. John walked forward. He kept his pace even. "You came from the north," he said. "Yes." "The men who came from the north before you were running?" "They were tired," the stranger replied. "I was not." It was stated without emphasis, the way you stated that water was cold. John studied the man's face and found nothing readable in it, not hostility, not calculation, not the performance of calm that men put on when they were frightened and hiding it. Just a kind of settled attention, as though John were a problem of moderate interest. "Jon Snow," John said. "I speak for Winterfell." A pause. "Yujiro Hanma." The name meant nothing to John. He filed it anyway. "What do you want here?" to understand what I'm walking into. The man Yujiro looked past John at the castle walls, the banners, the activity of an army making its preparations. You are expecting an attack? Yes. From the dead. From their king, and the army he leads. Yujiro looked at the walls a moment longer. How many of yours? Enough to hold the castle. Not enough to stop what's coming without help. And you think I'm help? John met his eyes. I think you're something. I haven't decided what yet. For the first time, something shifted in the man's expression, not quite a smile. Nothing so readable as that, but a slight adjustment, as though a mechanism had registered an input worth noting. That's more honest than I expected, he noted.
John.
Tyrion had positioned himself near the great hall entrance, which John recognized as a deliberate choice close enough to observe, far enough to have options. He fell into step beside John as they moved away from the gate. Well, Tyrion remarked quietly, he's certainly real. Did you doubt it? I doubted the version where he ate one. The rest seemed plausible enough, unfortunately. He glanced back toward where Yujiro had been directed to wait a decision that John was already fairly certain would hold, only as long as Yujiro had no particular reason to move. Did he tell you what he wants? He said he wants to understand what he's walking into. That's remarkably self-aware for someone who walked through a gate without being invited. Tyrion turned the thought over visibly. What does he actually want? The strongest thing in the world. That's what he told the ranger who came in last night. Tyrion was quiet for 3 steps. That's either the most dangerous thing anyone has said in this castle, or the most useful. Possibly both. Sansa thinks he's a catastrophe waiting to happen. Sansa is rarely wrong about that category of problem. He paused. She's also rarely wrong about what to do with them. What does she say? She hasn't said yet. She's watching. Tyrion pulled his cloak tighter against the cold. Here is what I keep returning to. We cannot command him. We cannot bribe him in any currency that matters to him. We almost certainly cannot threaten him into compliance. He let that sit for a moment. What we might be able to do is make his interests and our interests run in the same direction for long enough to matter. The dead are coming regardless. He appears to enjoy destroying things that need destroying. Those 2 facts could be useful together. And after the dead, Tyrion looked at him sideways. Let's survive the dead first. The incident happened 2 hours later in the outer yard, and it was over before most of the castle understood it had begun. A single one, which raised questions John would investigate afterward about how it had gotten inside the outer perimeter. His best guess was a body pulled in from outside. 2 days prior, someone who had died of cold and been stored rather than burned came up from the direction of the storage cellars, moving in that particular directionless way. They moved when separated from the larger mass. It took down a young stable hand before anyone reacted. And then 3 soldiers were on it with torches, and a 4th was bringing a dragonglass blade from his belt, and for a moment it was controlled and manageable. Then it got back up. The soldiers scattered. 2 of them ran. The 3rd held his ground to his credit, but kept retreating 1 step at a time, torch leveled between himself and the thing. The dragonglass soldier was still 10 yards out. The White had already turned toward the entrance, where the crowd had not yet thinned. Yujiro walked through the crowd like it was not there. He covered the distance between himself and the White, without appearing to accelerate. One moment he was at the edge of the yard, and then he was not, and then his hand was on the back of the thing's skull, and he drove its face into the frozen ground with a force that buried it 6 inches into the earth, and left a crater John felt through the soles of his boots. The White's limbs churned for a moment. They slowed, They stopped churning. Yujiro straightened and looked at the dragon glass soldier who had frozen. "Finish it," he said. The soldier finished it. Yujiro turned and walked back the way he had come. He did not check to see if anyone was watching. He did not look at the stable hand who had not gotten up. He did not look at anything in particular. The yard was very quiet. John became aware that Sansa was standing 3 feet to his left and had been for some time. He had not heard her arrive. "He didn't do that to save anyone," she said. "No," John agreed. He did it because the white was between him and where he was walking. John watched Yujiro's back as the man crossed toward the far wall of the yard. "Probably. Then we shouldn't tell ourselves a story about what he is that isn't true." Her voice was level and without heat, not angry, just precise the way she was precise when she was thinking rather than feeling. "He's useful. He's dangerous. He doesn't belong to anyone here." Those 3 things are all true at the same time. And we need to hold all 3. John looked at her. "What do you suggest?" "I suggest we stop pretending we have options we don't have." She glanced at him. "He'll fight the dead because the dead are in his way and because he wants to find whatever he came here to find. That's enough. It has to be." Just. Tyrion found John again near midday with news that was not unexpected and was nonetheless unwelcome. "Lady Daenerys has arrived," Tyrion reported. "Drogon and Rhaegal are overhead, and someone, I will not say who, has already told her about our guest." "What did she say?" "She said nothing, which in my experience is worse than something." He straightened the front of his coat with the care of a man preparing for a difficult conversation. "She wants to speak with you. Soon." John exhaled. The cold made it visible. Before he could move, a sound crossed the courtyard. Not a human sound, nothing so small as that. A shadow swept over the walls, vast and black-edged, and the torches nearest the gate guttered in a sudden displacement of air. Soldiers flinched. Horses in the stable broke into noise. 3 men near the east wall actually dropped to a knee without being told. John looked up. Drogon banked low over Winterfell, slow and deliberate black scales catching the pale winter light, the wingspan throwing a moving darkness across the yard below. The sound of him was the sound of something large enough to reshape a battlefield by existing in it. Across the yard, Yujiro had stopped walking. He was standing still, looking up, and his face was the face of a man seeing something he had been told about and finding the reality more interesting than the description. Not fear, not awe in the way awe usually presented itself. Something closer to recognition, the particular attention of a predator that has just located another predator worth taking seriously. He watched the dragon pass. Then quietly, to no one in particular, he said one word. "Good." He started walking again. John felt Tyrion come to stand beside him without looking away from the figure crossing the courtyard below. "She saw that," Tyrion murmured. It was not a question. "Yes." A pause in which neither of them needed to say the rest. Daenerys had just watched a man stand beneath her dragon without flinching. She had watched him say one word and turn away. John did not know exactly what that looked like from wherever she was standing, but he knew what it meant for tomorrow. Sansa from somewhere behind them spoke before either of them did. "I already knew," she called from somewhere behind them. Tyrion had spent a considerable portion of his life studying the mechanics of power, and what he understood better than most was that power was not a thing you possessed. It was a thing other people agreed to believe in. The moment they stopped believing, you had nothing but the symbols, the title, the throne. The creature with wings and fire and symbols were only as durable as the last time someone had been too afraid to question them. He was thinking about this as he watched Daenerys cross the training ground, with 12 unsullied at her back, and Jorah half a step behind her left shoulder, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who had decided this conversation was going to go a specific way. Yujiro was already there. He had been there for some time, in fact, standing near the far end of the training ground with his arms at his sides, watching the Dothraki run drills with the detached interest of a man at a market assessing livestock he had no intention of buying. He had not been invited. He had also not been stopped, which said something about how quickly his reputation had propagated through Winterfell's ranks overnight. 2 guards had apparently been posted to keep him away from the Dragon Queen's arrival preparations. Tyrion had learned upon asking that both guards were currently helping in the kitchens, and had not explained why. This is going to be bad, Tyrion observed to no one in particular. Beside him, Varys watched with his hands folded inside his sleeves. It was going to be bad regardless. The only variable is the degree. Helpful, thank you. I try. Daenerys stopped, 20 feet from Yujiro, farther back than she usually held herself from anyone. Tyrion noted that. She noted it too, he suspected, because she took one deliberate step forward to close part of the distance. Jorah's hand moved toward his sword hilt and then fell away again. The most honest gesture of the morning. "You're the one they're talking about," she said. Her voice carried the particular register she used in formal address, clear, unhurried, calibrated to be heard at the back of a room. Yujiro looked at her the way he had looked at the Dothraki drills, assessing, categorizing, not impressed by the assessment. "Probably," he said. "I am Daenerys of House Targaryen, first of my name, Queen of the..." I heard the titles. His tone was not rude in any conventional sense. It was simply indifferent in the way that carried more weight than rudeness, because rudeness at least acknowledged the thing it was dismissing. "You command the soldiers, you ride the dragons." A pause, in which he turned his attention briefly to the sky, then back to her. "They follow you because the dragons exist." The temperature of the training ground dropped, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Tyrion watched the unsullied in his peripheral vision. They were trained to stillness, trained to show nothing. But 3 of them had shifted weight in the same half-second. The Dothraki at the far end had gone quiet. Word was moving through the gathered soldiers the way fire moved through dry grass, not visible until it was everywhere. Daenerys kept her composure. Tyrion gave her that. She had been practicing composure since she was old enough to need it. "My soldiers follow me," she said, each word placed with precision, "because I have earned their loyalty." "You have not been tested," Yujiro replied. "Neither have they. Not by anything that didn't already fear you." He was not raising his voice. He never raised his voice, Tyrion had begun to understand. Volume was for people who needed others to feel the force of what they were saying. Loyalty built on the shadow of a dragon is fear wearing a different name. Someone in the gathered ranks made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, the kind that meant a thought had formed that the person was not sure they should be having. This Tyrion thought is not a confrontation. This is a referendum, and it is being held in public, and there is no good outcome from here, only outcomes that are less ruinous than others. He opened his mouth to intervene. Daenerys spoke first. Not loudly, not rashly. She turned her face slightly upward toward the sky to the south, where a shape had been circling since morning, and she made a sound in the back of her throat that was less a command than a calling. Something old and intimate, the sound of a woman speaking in a language that had no alphabet. The shape in the sky changed direction. Drogon came down fast. Not in the banking theatrical descent Tyrion had seen used to intimidate envoys and foreign dignitaries that was performance beautiful and calculated. this was functional. The dragon dropped altitude in a hard angle, wings beating twice to arrest momentum, and landed 40 feet from Daenerys, which put him closer to Yujiro than to anyone else in the ground. With an impact that traveled through the stone and up through the soles of Tyrion's boots and into his back teeth. The heat arrived a half-second later. Not fire, just the ambient warmth of a creature that burned from the inside, pressing against the frost in the air like a hand pressed against glass. Soldiers fell back. Not all of them the Unsullied held, because the Unsullied always held, but enough that the shape of the gathering changed a new perimeter, forming around the epicenter of scale and heat and the low sound Drogon made. That was not quite a growl and not quite thunder, and was entirely its own category of warning. Yujiro turned to face the dragon. He turned the same way he faced everything Tyrion had watched him face. No preparation, no bracing. Just a complete transfer of attention. Clinical and total, the kind that made Tyrion's skin register something his brain was still processing. Drogon's head lowered. The neck extended, that long, predatory extension that preceded the intake before a burn. The throat swelling slightly, the jaw beginning to part. Yujiro took 3 steps toward it. Not away. Not to the side. Toward. Tyrion heard someone behind him say something in Dothraki that he was fairly certain translated to an invocation of a god he did not personally worship. The fire came. Not the full torrent, a warning, a focused stream aimed low at the ground between them. The kind of demonstration that turned stone to slag and left a line of scorched earth as a boundary marker. The heat rolled outward, and Tyrion raised his arm against it, and 3 men to his left went down to their knees, not from injury, but from pure animal reaction to that particular quality of heat, the kind the body understood before the mind did. When he lowered his arm, Yujiro was 6 feet closer to the dragon than he had been. He had moved through the edge of the burn. Not through the center. He was not attempting to prove immunity to fire, and Tyrion suspected he had no such immunity. But along the angle where the stream had not yet arrived, reading the direction of the neck, the cant of the jaw, the way the wing on the left had shifted to compensate for the weight transfer of the head coming down. He had moved into the space the fire was not going to be before the fire had decided where it was going. Then he was inside the dragon's reach. The first strike went to the underside of the jaw, short upward the heel of his palm, driving into the soft tissue where the scales were thinner, and the nerve clusters closer to the surface. Drogon's head snapped back. Not the practiced recoil of a creature retreating, but the involuntary recoil of one that had registered pain in a place it had not expected to find it. The second went to the left foreleg, a lateral strike to the joint at an angle that buckled the limb and dropped the dragon's left shoulder by 3 feet. Drogon's weight shifted wrong. One wing beat hard to compensate, and the wind it threw knocked 2 soldiers flat. The third, Yujiro, had his hand on the base of the left wing's primary joint fingers, finding the leverage point between scale and tendon, with the foreleg already buckled. The wing had become a lever rather than muscle. The weight distribution wrong in a way the creature's body had not compensated for yet. He pulled, and Drogon lurched sideways with a sound that was not a roar exactly, but the sound a creature made when it was surprised and in pain and had not previously known those 2 things could arrive at once. Drogon scrambled. 4 tons of dragon scrambling for footing was a thing that reshaped the immediate geography. Stone cracked. The ground to Tyrion's right developed a new fracture line. A section of the low outer wall that had been standing since before anyone currently alive was born, folded, and went down. Jon Snow was already moving. Tyrion had not seen him start. He was simply there between Daenerys and the chaos, one hand on her arm, not restraining, guiding the difference between those 2 things being the thing that kept it from becoming another crisis. Jorah was on the other side of her, and the 2 of them formed a corridor out of the immediate blast radius of a dragon that had lost its balance and was deciding what to do about it. "Enough," Daenerys said. Then a half-beat later, in a different register, quieter, directed at the soldiers still gripping their weapons behind her. "Stand down, all of you." Her voice was steady. Tyrion filed that away as a data point about what kind of person she was under pressure that had no precedent. She had said the first word toward Yujiro, and the second toward her own ranks. And the sequencing of those two things was deliberate enough that even the Dothraki at the far end understood which direction the authority was flowing. Yujiro stepped back. The distinction was visible and intentional, a man stepping away from something he had finished examining, having extracted what he came for. Drogon beat his wings once, twice, and lifted. The downwash scattered every loose thing in the training ground and staggered the soldiers who had held their positions and caused the ones who had already fallen back to fall back further. He gained altitude in a long climbing arc to the south and did not immediately return. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Tyrion found he had been holding his breath. He released it now, which was embarrassing, but there was no one nearby whose opinion of him he cared enough about to be embarrassed in front of. Varys had not moved from his position at the edge of the ground. He was watching Daenerys with something Tyrion had no name for. In any of the 6 languages, he spoke a stillness behind the eyes that meant a man was revising a calculation he had believed settled. Yujiro was looking at his own hand, not the hand he had struck with the one that had found the joint of the wing. He flexed it once, twice, examining the result, the way a craftsman examined a tool after using it on material of unexpected density. A faint redness along the outer edge of the palm, the kind of mark that would be gone by morning. Nothing more. He looked up, and his gaze found Daenerys. She was standing straight. She had not taken shelter behind Jon or Jorah. She had stepped back to a position she chose, jaw set, chin level, the arithmetic behind her eyes running fast and cold. "Your dragon," Yujiro said. "Dangerous. The fire especially. If I can't close the distance, I lose." A pause, flat and brief. "I can close the distance." He turned away. Tyrion watched him go. Then he turned to find Varys already at his elbow, which was impressive given that Varys had been 30 feet away the last time he had checked. "Well," Tyrion said. "Indeed," Varys replied. He kept his voice low enough that it did not carry. Half the Dothraki just watched a man walk into dragonfire and come out having struck the dragon. The other half watched their queen's dragon retreat. He let that settle for a precisely calculated number of seconds. By nightfall, both halves will have talked to the other half. And by morning, the story will have traveled to every lord, still deciding whether to commit their forces. Tyrion looked at the line of scorched earth still faintly smoking, at the collapsed section of wall, at the soldiers helping each other upright, not quite meeting one another's eyes, the particular avoidance of people thinking the same thought they hadn't yet decided they were permitted to think. One of the unsullied, he noticed, was looking at the scorch mark on the ground rather than at Daenerys. A small thing, the kind of small thing that became a large thing if enough people did it at the same time. "What do you suggest?" he asked. "Nothing yet," Varys said. "I suggest nothing yet. But I would begin thinking very carefully about what we need people to believe happened here and whether we have any remaining ability to shape that belief." He paused, "And I would think about what he wants. Because a man who came here looking for the strongest thing in the world has just received an answer, and that answer was incomplete, and he knows it." "The Night King," Tyrion said. "The Night King." Varys agreed. He unfolded his hands from his sleeves just long enough to straighten the front of his robe, then folded them again. "Which means he is going to be here when the dead arrive, not because we asked him and not because he owes us anything. He will be here because we are standing between him and what he came for. A thin pause. I am not certain whether that is fortunate or simply inevitable. He walked away, without waiting for an answer, which was Tyrion reflected very much his way of indicating that the question was not rhetorical, but that the answer was something you were expected to arrive at on your own. Tyrion stood in the cooling air for a moment longer, looking at the place where the dragon had been. From somewhere in the castle above, he heard the distant sound of raised Dothraki voices. Not alarm, not battle, just the particular quality of argument that meant a story was being retold, and the telling was already changing. It had started. The trebuchets fired first. Jon had ordered the signal an hour before the scouts came back, because by the time scouts came back from the tree line, it was already too late to do anything except react. And reacting was how you died. The burning pitch arced out beyond the walls in long orange trails and came down in the dark somewhere past the field, and for 30 seconds the world outside Winterfell was lit in wavering amber, and Jon could see them. There was no front line. There was no formation. There were whites as far as the firelight reached, and past the firelight there were more, and past those there were more still. And the moaning that rose from all of them together was not a sound that belonged to any living thing. It was the sound of a landscape, the sound of weather. Hold, Jon said to no one and everyone. Hold until they reach the trench. Beside him on the ramparts, Ed exhaled through his teeth. There's a lot of them. There always is. The first wave broke against the trench line like water against a seawall, except water didn't pile. The foremost whites dropped into the burning ditch, and the ones behind walked over them. And the ones behind those walked over those, and the fire that was supposed to buy time became a bridge of burning dead, and the cavalry that rode out to push them back lost 3 horses in the first pass and came back with half the riders they'd left with. Jon was already moving before the eastern gate captain's horn sounded. He took the stairs 3 at a time, Longclaw clear of its scabbard, and hit the outer ground running. On the left, Dragonfire swept the field in short passes. Rhaegal working the flank, buying seconds at a time. The Unsullied were holding a line near the far wall with the geometric discipline of people who had been trained to hold lines and had not yet stopped believing in the concept. A cluster of Dothraki were engaging on the right flank with the specific noise of men fighting at close quarters in the dark, short, violent, overlapping. Someone was screaming in a language Jon didn't speak. Someone had stopped screaming. Then he saw the breach. 40 yards left where the outer defense had been anchored by a section of heavy timber barricade. 3 whites had pushed through the gap, then 6, then too many to count individually, and the soldiers assigned to that section had fallen back because soldiers fell back from things that kept getting up, and the gap was becoming a hole. Jon turned for it. He was 20 yards out when he realized someone had already reached it. Yujiro stood in the breach. He was not holding a weapon. He was not braced in any defensive posture Jon recognized. He was simply occupying the space standing in the narrowest point of the gap, with his arms loose and his weight distributed in a way that suggested he was ready to move in 8 directions simultaneously, and had already decided which one. The whites came through in the press of numbers that made individual fighting irrelevant, and Yujiro made it relevant again. He moved into them rather than receiving them. The first went down with a sound like green wood splitting. The second he caught at the wrist and used the momentum to redirect it into the third and fourth, not stopping either of them permanently, but tangling the limbs, breaking the coordination, compressing 3 threats into a single pile of disrupted motion. A white walker at the rear of the press tried to push through the resulting jam, and Yujiro drove his elbow into the bridge of its nose with a force that dropped it to its knees. It hit the ground and did not immediately rise. The limbs moved wrong, like something trying to remember the sequence. The pile of whites he had disrupted was still churning, still trying to stand still, reaching, still functional in the half-mechanical way of things that had been dead long enough to lose the slower impulses. Jon crossed the remaining distance, and Longclaw took two of them through the back of the skull in quick succession, the Valyrian steel biting where ordinary steel would have skittered off bone. One of the Night's Watch men behind him was working with a dragon-glass spear, methodical, economical. The breach held. Yujiro looked at the dead piled in the gap, and then looked at Jon with an attention that was brief and assessing, and then moved on. 3 more gaps forming, he said. Left, far right, and below the eastern tower. Jon hadn't seen any of that. He looked. He couldn't see it yet. The firelight didn't reach that far. How do you know? Yujiro had already moved. The next hour existed in pieces. Jon remembered them in fragments the way all combat resolved afterward, not as sequence, but as isolated moments, each one too full to contain anything before or after. A Dothraki rider going down 20 feet to his left horse, and man together, and the horse getting back up and the man not. A Night's Watch boy, 15 at most. Jon thought, though he hadn't asked, catching his cloak on a broken stake while pulling back from a breach, stumbling going under before anyone reached him. Nobody reached him. The moment the unsullied line compressed from 20 across to 11. Not because 11 had died, but because the geometry of survival had made 20 unsustainable, and 11 was what remained. Yujiro appearing at the eastern tower gap and closing it, in the time it took Jon to reach the far right, and Jon arriving at the far right to find the problem already solved, the dead, lying in configurations that spoke to being struck from specific angles at specific joints, and 2 Night's Watchmen finishing them off with dragonglass and the particular efficiency of people grateful to have something to finish rather than something to start. He watched Yujiro work once properly, from close enough to see the mechanics. A crest of the dead, moving as a group 4 or 4 in genuine coordination, which likely meant a White Walker nearby, threading control through them. And Yujiro let the crest break against him, and then went into the center of it in the way a stone went into water. Not stopping the water, but changing where it went. He stripped the weight from the outers to use the bodies as obstacles for the inner 2, found the White Walker that was threading control through the pack and drove a straight strike into the thing's sternum that took it off its feet and put it down against the wall. A dragonglass dagger hit the White Walker a second later, thrown from somewhere Jon hadn't tracked. The thing dissolved. Yujiro watched the pack of whites lose coordination the way they always did when the White Walker guiding them was remove the particular mechanical confusion of soldiers whose command signal had cut out and stood back. That's how it connects, he said to no one in particular. The ones behind them are keeping the chain. Break the chain. Jon filed that away. We know. You know. Yujiro answered, but you're not doing it. Jon had no answer to that, because it was accurate.
Wasan.
The sky changed near the middle of the night. Jon noticed it first as sound, or rather as an absence of sound in a part of the sky that had been full of the noise of Rhaegal working the left flank, the bone-deep percussion of wings and fire that had become a baseline for the last hour. Then silence, and then the wind changed direction, and it changed wrong, coming from the wrong quarter in a way that made the fires on the wall gutter and lean. Above where Rhaegal had been, there was now something else. He could not see it clearly. What he could see was the moon. And the moon being briefly blocked by a wingspan that was wrong, too large, too slow, moving with the particular heaviness of something that had been changed from what it was into something it was not meant to be. It made no sound that a living creature made. What it produced instead was a pressure, the way very loud sound pressed on the ears, except it was cold. The soldiers on the eastern rampart heard it before they saw it. John watched 3 of them lower their weapons simultaneously without being ordered, to the way the body sometimes understood things before the mind gave permission. John found himself doing the math he didn't want to do. Rhaegal had been working the left flank for an hour. Daenerys was on Drogon somewhere south. And whatever that shadow was, it wasn't Rhaegal's shape, and it wasn't Drogon's, and there was no third living dragon in the sky over Winterfell. Across the wall, 30 feet down the rampart, Yujiro had stopped moving. He was looking up at the shadow with the same quality of attention he had turned on Drogon in the courtyard. Not awe, not fear. Something that occupied the same register as both, without being either. His head had tilted back. The wind pulled his red hair sideways. He didn't blink. "That's the dead one," John said flatly. Yujiro was quiet for a moment. The shadow crossed the moon again. "It flies different," Yujiro murmured, not to John, not to anyone, just sound given to an observation that needed filing. "Heavier on the left. Viserion." The name came out of John like something he'd been carrying at the back of his throat. "I know what it is." Yujiro brought his gaze down from the sky and swept it across the rampart, the breach still opening below the eastern tower, the 1,000 things unraveling simultaneously in the dark beyond the perimeter. He looked back at John. Something had shifted in his bearing, not tension, not unease. The opposite. The slight forward lean of something that had been holding itself to a standard and just had that standard raised. "Now it's interesting," he said. Viserion came in low. John heard it first, not the cold pressure from the rampart earlier, but the active version of that sound. That sound, the version that meant the thing had a direction and a target and was already committed. He turned, and the undead dragon was 30 feet above the outer perimeter, neck extended, and what came out of its throat was fire but cold. Not the orange-red of a living dragon's breath. Blue-white pressurized the temperature of a place nothing living had ever been. It hit the section of wall to the east, and the stone did not burn. It cracked. It split along fault lines that hadn't mattered when the castle was built, because nothing alive ran that cold. The soldiers on that section had 1 second of shadow, and then the shadow was everything, and 3 of them went down under falling stone, and the rest scattered into the inner ground. Drogon answered from the south. John heard the exchange. 2 living things and 1 dead thing, communicating in a register below language. And then Drogon's fire lit the sky orange, and Viserion banked hard to avoid it. The undead dragon moving with a heaviness that was different from Drogon's speed. Slower in the turn, but relentless in the return. Circling back like something that had forgotten what pain meant, and therefore couldn't be discouraged by the threat of it. The left flank folded. John had known it was coming. He had arranged the forces to survive 2 flanks failing, had discussed it with Davos and Jorah, and had accepted in the abstract that some configurations of bad outcomes were survivable. In the abstract was very different from standing in the inner ground, watching the unsullied contract into a circle around the approach to the Godswood, and understanding that the abstract had arrived. He ran toward it anyway. The Godswood approach was the tightest ground in Winterfell trees, pressing in from both sides. The path narrowing to a width that nullified numbers and made every yard a separate problem. Theon and the Ironborn had held it for 2 hours and were still holding it. And the reason they were still holding it was that the path's geometry could be defended by 5 determined people against 50. The problem was that 50 had become 300, and the chain of control behind them had grown coherent enough to feel wrong. John could see them from the inner ground, the mass of the dead pressing down the approach in a density that made individual resistance meaningless, and at the back of the press, 3 White Walkers standing with the stillness of commanders. watching a subordinate operation that was proceeding on schedule. They were not fighting. They were directing, threading control through the pack the way a signal threaded through a wire. And the pack moved with a precision that a mob of the dead should not have had. Theon's line was 30 seconds from breaking. Jon looked for Yujiro and found him 20 feet to his left, also watching the approach. "The three at the back," Jon said. "The commanders. I see them. If we break them, I know." Yujiro was already moving before he finished, not toward the mouth of the approach where the fighting was thickest, but along the inner edge of the tree line, threading the gap between the press and the castle wall. Going around. Going to the flank where the White Walkers stood. Jon turned to the approach and pushed in. What happened in the next 4 minutes did not resolve cleanly in any direction. The dead pushed. The living pushed back. Theon went down once and got back up, and Jon did not have time to assess the damage. Longclaw moved in the tight space with the efficiency of a weapon being used exactly as it was meant to be used. Short strokes, no room for anything elaborate, every motion tied to function. Then the sound changed. Not loud or different. A shift in the quality of the noise from the far side of the press. The kind of change that happened when something significant altered the physics of a space. The White Walkers were no longer standing still. One of them had its weapon, an ice-formed blade, long and pale, raised in a guard rather than a ready position, which meant it had moved into guard, which meant something had made it move into guard. The pack in front of Jon stuttered. Not stopped, not routed. Just a half-second of interrupted instruction, like a signal dropping out the dead at the front, losing their coordination for long enough that Theon's men found angles. Drove dragonglass into the openings that hadn't been there a moment before. Jon heard one of the White Walkers make a sound. He had not known they could make sounds. He pushed through the thinning press toward the far side. He saw Yujiro for 3 seconds. That was all. 3 seconds in which he understood what had changed. 2 of the White Walkers were down. Not dissolved that required the stone blades or Valyrian steel, and neither had reached them yet. But down in the specific sense of having been stripped of their upright position, one against the base of a tree with its blade somewhere in the undergrowth limbs, at angles that suggested the joints had been introduced to forces they were not built for. The other was on its knees with Yujiro's knee on its back, pinned against the root-broken ground. The third White Walker came for him from the right. Yujiro released the pinned one, left it for someone else to finish, did not waste the moment on something already neutralized, and turned to meet the third. Jon had seen him move before, had watched him work in the field for hours. He thought he had calibrated some understanding of what Yujiro was. He had not. What came off Yujiro's back was not something Jon had language for. The musculature shifted in a way that muscle should not shift, rising along the spine and shoulder girdle into a configuration that cast a shadow larger than the man, a silhouette that the firelight from the burning tree nearby caught and held and made wrong in a way that reached past recognition into something older. It was not monstrous. It was not supernatural. It was the body taken to a register that bodies were not meant to reach. The way a sound pushed past a certain threshold, stopped from it being sound and became pressure. The soldiers still standing in the approach went quiet. Not from awe, from the same instinct that made animals stop moving when an apex predator's attention sharpened. The third White Walker drove its blade forward. Yujiro stepped inside the arc, one hand catching the forearm at the wrist before the extension reached full force. Redirected the momentum downward, not blocking using, and the walker's own strike carried it into the root-broken ground face first, with a force that shattered the ice blade against the tree root on impact. He was on it before it could orient knee at the base of the skull, one hand finding the shoulder joint and inverting it past the point the architecture allowed. A dragon glass spear hit the walker through the back a moment later. Thrown by a Night's Watchman, Jon did not recognize from somewhere in the undergrowth to the north. The walker dissolved. Yujiro straightened. The shape on his back was still there, still present in the firelight, rising and falling with his breathing. He looked at the two he had pinned, the one against the tree, the one at the root, and looked at the soldiers nearest them. He did not gesture, did not instruct, simply looked and then looked away, and the soldiers understood and moved. The godswood went quiet at the wrong time. Not silent, there was still fighting in the outer ground, still Drogon and Viserion exchanging fire and cold flame in the sky above. But the godswood's own noise died, the press of the dead thinning as the command chain fractured, and in the quiet Jon could hear his own breathing and Theon's and something else, the creak of the heart tree and wind that was not natural wind. The Night King was at the tree. Jon had not seen him cross the ground. One moment the godswood path was contested. The next it was clear. And the Night King stood 10 feet from Bran's chair with the specific stillness of something that had never needed to hurry, because it had never encountered a timeline it could not outlast. Bran was not looking at the Night King. His eyes were open and white, and somewhere else, entirely. Theon moved. Jon knew before it happened that it was going to fail. Not because Theon was insufficient, but because the Night King was a category of problem that valor did not solve, and it failed quickly and without ceremony. And Theon hit the ground and did not rise, and the Night King raised his hand. Yujiro came in from the left, not from the approach path, from the tree line moving through the undergrowth in the dark with the silence of something that had not announced itself. He crossed the distance between the tree line and the Night King. In the time it took Jon to register that he was there, and he hit the Night King's raised arm at the elbow with a downward strike that was not designed to injure the arm, was not the target. The arm was the lever. The intention was the half-second of interrupted motion, the slight torque through the torso, the repositioning of weight from the forward stance to the recovery stance. The Night King turned. For one moment, one fraction of a moment, the kind of time measured in heartbeats rather than seconds. The Night King's attention was on Yujiro, and his stance was open, and the angle between his body and the heart tree was wrong. Bran's eyes returned. Jon heard nothing. He felt the cold change first a shift in the air at the edge of the tree line, fast, low, soundless. He saw the Night King's face register something, not surprise. Something colder than surprise, the barest possible acknowledgement that a variable had entered a calculation without prior accounting. Arya hit him from behind, and above she had come through the branches overhead. Jon realized had been in the canopy, waiting for exactly this orientation, and the dragon glass dagger went into the base of his neck at the angle that mattered. The Night King did not fall dramatically. He came apart. The ice that was his substance fractured from the point of impact, outward, spreading through his chest and arms and legs, in a pattern that looked like the cracking of a frozen lake under a weight. It was never meant to bear, and then there was nothing where he had been, but a scattering of ice shards, catching the firelight, and a cold that lingered for 2 more seconds, and then left. Across Winterfell, the dead stopped. Not gradually, not individually, all at once, in the specific way of a system that had been receiving a signal, and no longer was every moving thing that had been moving going still between one moment and the next. In the godswood, in the approach, in the inner ground and the outer field, and wherever the army had been pressing against whatever remained of the perimeter. All of its silence broken only by the sound of the living, trying to understand that they were still living. Jon stood in the godswood for a long time without moving. Arya was on the ground 10 feet from the heart tree on her hands and knees, breathing. She did not look at him, and he did not interrupt, whatever that was. Bran's eyes had returned to their normal color, and he was sitting in his chair exactly as he had been sitting before the Night King arrived, as if the whole of it had been weather that had passed over him without touching him. Yujiro stood at the edge of the tree line. The shape on his back had subsided. What remained was just a man, a very large man, breathing evenly, standing in the dark among the scattered remnants of things that had dissolved. But John could still feel the register of it, the residue of something he did not have a name for. Yujiro looked at the ice shards where the Night King had been. He looked at the sky where Drogon was circling without Viserion chasing him anymore. He looked at the Ironborn helping Theon at the Night's Watchmen, working through the still forms with torches to ensure that still meant finished. Then he looked at the Godswood's ruined ground, the churned earth and broken roots, and the scattered remnants of a war that had just ended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Finished," he said. Not to anyone. The same tone he had used to file data throughout the night. He let a breath out slowly. "The rest will be worse." Barnum. Across the inner ground, John caught movement in his peripheral vision, a northern lord he recognized but could not name in his current state, standing at the entrance to the great hall with 3 of his men. The lord was not looking at the pyres already being lit, not looking at the still forms laid out in rows. He was looking at Daenerys, who had dismounted from Drogon somewhere on the field and was walking toward the castle, with Jorah beside her. The Lord's expression held something that was not gratitude, and was not relief, and was not the face of a man whose war had just ended. John had seen that face before. It was the face of a man who had just decided when his war was going to begin. The pyres burned for 2 days. Sansa had not slept. She had tried for an hour in the chair in her chambers, while the smoke thickened the air outside her window. And her body had refused on the grounds that sleep required a belief in tomorrow that she could not currently locate. So she had risen and gone to work because work was what remained when everything else had been taken, and Winterfell had a great deal of work that needed doing. The numbers were the first thing. The Meister brought them before the 2nd hour of morning on the day after parchment covered in careful columns that turned human beings into figures and figures into resource problems. 412 confirmed dead. 83 more missing presumed. Of those, 47 had been field medics or people with knowledge the castle could not easily replace. The grain stores were down to a level that would sustain the current population through winter, only if no large armies needed feeding past the next fortnight. The horses, the ones that remained, had eaten through their feed in the sustained cold and would need supplement that did not currently exist. She read the numbers twice, filed them, went to the next parchment. The political problem arrived before the numbers were fully cold. She heard it first through the walls. Not the words, not yet, but the quality of the noise coming from the great hall. The exact register of men who had survived something, and had not yet decided what that survival entitled them to. She pulled her cloak tighter and went. The great hall held perhaps 60 people, which was a fraction of what it had held 2 days prior, and still too many for the quality of conversation currently taking place. 3 of the northern lords had positioned themselves near the fire at the hall's center, not eating, not resting, forming the kind of cluster that meant a point was being made by physical proximity rather than words. Across from them, Daenerys sat at the high table with Jorah at her left and an empty seat where Tyrion had been. She was not eating either. Her hands were flat on the table, and her eyes were moving through the room with the careful attention of someone cataloging. Sansa took her position near the eastern wall and listened. The content of the argument was not complicated. It was in fact the same argument that had been made in some form after every battle in the history of the North, who had done what, who deserved what, and who was going to run things now that the running of things was again a question worth asking. Lord Glover was speaking, which meant the argument had moved past the point of subtlety. Glover had never been subtle. "The North stood," he said, and left the rest unsaid because the rest did not need to be said. The rest was the implication that the North had stood while others had needed to be asked. Daenerys did not respond. This was, Sansa understood, a choice rather than an oversight. The choice of someone who had decided that responding to the specific point would validate the premise. What Daenerys did instead was signal to one of her Unsullied, and the Unsullied moved to the doors, and the doors opened, and 3 more Unsullied entered. It was not a threat, technically. It was a reminder. Glover looked at the Unsullied, and then looked at Daenerys, and then looked away. The argument did not stop. It shifted. Sansa found Tyrion on the eastern parapet an hour later. He was looking south with the expression of a man who had not slept either and was not bothering to conceal it. A cup of wine was in his hand, and from the color of the cup's interior, when the light caught it, the cup had been full fairly recently. "How bad is the hall?" she asked. "About as bad as I'd expected, which is worse than most people expected." He took a measured sip. "Glover has been talking to 3 other lords. They haven't decided anything yet, but they're building toward a decision, and the direction they're building toward is not one that benefits anyone currently camped south of Winterfell. Daenerys knows. Daenerys knows everything that happens in rooms she's in. The rooms she's not in are the problem." He turned the cup in his hands. "She made a decision this morning that I would have advised against if she'd asked me, which she didn't." Sansa waited. She told Jorah quietly, but not quietly enough that no one in the castle was to formally acknowledge what the man did. In conversation with allies, in reports, in whatever official account of the battle gets assembled. He paused. She used the phrase, "complicated the narrative." The wind off the battlements was sharp enough that Sansa felt it through the fur at her collar. She thought about that phrase for a moment. "She's not wrong," she said finally. "She's not wrong." Tyrion agreed. "She's also not going to succeed, because 60 people watched it happen, and one of them is Dothraki, and the Dothraki are constitutionally incapable of not telling that story to everyone they meet." He gestured vaguely with the cup. "By spring, it will be legend. By summer, it will be a song. None of which helps her govern." Sansa looked at the smoke still rising from the pyres on the field below. Where is he now? "The yard. He's been there since dawn, just standing watching people carry bodies." A pause. "It unsettles the men." "Good," Sansa said. "Unsettled men work faster." Tyrion looked at her sideways, and something in his face shifted that she could not quite read. "You know," he said, dropping his voice, "there are moments when you remind me of people I've known who ended up with a great deal of it and not much else." Sansa considered that. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation. I've learned to be careful with warnings." "Sure." He finished the wine. "What do you intend to do about him?" "Nothing. That's the point." She straightened her cloak. "You can't do anything about him. The moment you try, you've already lost. The only move is to make his absence less disruptive than his presence. And if he decides to stay, he won't." She was right. She did not know this until mid-morning when a steward came to her with the information that the man had been seen walking the South Road on foot alone. Moving at a pace that the steward struggled to name, steady, unhurried the pace of something that had decided where it was going and found the journey beneath comment. Before he left, he had 2 conversations. Sansa learned of them through the network she had spent 3 years carefully building, not spies exactly. She disliked the word. People who paid attention and knew she wanted to know things. The first had been with Jon. brief in the inner passage near the armory, no one else present. Her source had not heard the words, but had seen the posture John upright Yujiro looking through him slightly. John saying something that ended with what might have been gratitude. Yujiro replying with something short. John going still for a moment, then nodding once, in a way that held neither agreement nor refusal, but something flatter than both. The second had been with Tyrion. This one she heard verbatim from Tyrion himself later when he sought her out to relay it. I asked him what he wanted, Tyrion said. Directly. Told him I had limited patience for theatrical ambiguity. And he said, I want to find out if there's anything left in the world that can make me work for it. Then he looked at me like I was furniture and left. Sansa turned that over. And what did you say? Nothing useful. I said, I hope you find it, which was honest, but not particularly strategic. He paused. He didn't acknowledge it. I don't think he heard it. I'm not sure it would have meant anything to him if he had. She watched him go from the rampart above the south gate. He was already 200 yards down the road, and still visibly himself. That unmistakable width of shoulder, the red of his hair against the gray of the sky. The pace that did not vary and had not varied since the gate. No horse, no pack, no company. The road south stretched ahead through fields. Still marked with an army's passage, churned earth, abandoned equipment, a broken cartwheel, half buried in frozen mud that no one had come back for. A group of Dothraki riders passed him going the opposite direction, heading back toward the castle. Sansa watched them give him a wider berth than the road required. She watched one of them look back. Behind her, the great hall had started again. Someone's voice raised, an answer raised higher, the specific music of people who had nearly died together and were now negotiating over the meaning of it. Yujiro did not look back at the castle. At the far edge of the south gate sightline, where the road curved around the tree line and disappeared, he walked past the curve without slowing. The gray morning swallowed him, between one breath and the next. Sansa stood at the parapet a moment longer, her hands flat on the cold stone, and then a messenger arrived at her elbow with another parchment, and she turned away from the road, and there was work. Qyburn had spent his career studying the limits of the human body, and he had learned one thing above all others. There were no limits. There were only thresholds that had not yet been reached by the right application of the right pressure in the right sequence. He had come to believe this so thoroughly that he had stopped finding it disturbing and started finding it useful. He believed it less firmly now. He had received the first account from a Meister's raven out of White Harbor. Garbled as ravens always were, the transcription done by someone whose hands shook. A figure moving south on the King's Road, red-haired, on foot, no weapon, no horse, no escort. Soldiers who had attempted to stop him for questioning had declined to follow through at the moment of contact. Wording unclear. He had received 3 more accounts in the following week, each from a different settlement, each more specific in its fear and less specific in its detail. By the time he assembled them into something resembling a picture, he had come to 2 conclusions. The first, the accounts were substantially true. The second, the subject was not a man operating within any framework he had previously designed around. He had gone to Cersei with both conclusions. She will want specifics, he had told himself on the stairs. What he told her instead was this: he is coming. He has no allegiance to the Dragon Queen. He has no allegiance to anyone. He is coming because King's Landing is at the end of the road he is walking, and he wants to see what is here. Cersei had listened from her chair wine untouched, which told him everything about her state of mind. What does he want from me? Nothing you can give or withhold. That is the problem. a silence in which he watched her run the calculation. She always ran how to threaten, how to bribe, how to use, how to discard. He watched her reach the same wall he had reached. He watched her set down the calculation and pick up a different one. "Then we kill him," she said, "with everything we have in the right sequence before he reaches the keep." It was Qyburn reflected the correct response. It was the only response available to her. He was not certain it would work, but he was certain that nothing else would work better, and that was usually sufficient. King's Landing had 7 entry points that mattered. Qyburn spent 4 days redesigning all of them. The Scorpions went up first, not on the towers, where they had always been positioned to threaten aerial targets, but lower at the angles where the bolt traveled along a street rather than across it. 14 of them repositioned in a grid that meant any figure moving from the outer gates toward the keep would cross the firing line of at least 3 at any given point. He had his men test the geometry with a weighted cart moving at the pace of a walking man. The bolts struck within 3 feet of where they were aimed. He adjusted 2 of the emplacements and tested again. The Golden Company he arranged in what he privately called the compression corridor, a sequence of positions that would force anything moving toward the keep to pass through 3 successive choke points, each manned by soldiers whose orders were to hold the choke point, not to pursue, not to advance, simply to occupy the geometry and wait for the next layer to engage. He had observed that men who pursued unfamiliar opponents tended to die faster than men who held position. He had arranged the company accordingly. The poison took the most thought. Contact delivery was unreliable against a target that moved unpredictably. Airborne dispersal in an open city was impractical. He settled on a variant delivery laced into the surface of every object that a person moving through the city might grip: door frames, ladder rungs, the iron handles of portcullises. The compound was of his own formulation, something that worked through the skin over several minutes of contact, not lethal on brief exposure. Cumulatively over the course of an hour's movement through a prepared city, it should produce significant neurological disruption. The wildfire caches he positioned last, and with the most care. There were 11 of them placed beneath the flagstones of the main approach corridor and 2 secondary alleys. Each was connected to a trigger mechanism that he had redesigned twice for reliability. The triggers were manual. A soldier pulling a lever at the end of a long cord, not automatic, because automatic mechanisms could be activated by the wrong weight at the wrong time. And Qyburn had no interest in killing his own men prematurely. He had briefed Cersei on each element. She had approved each one without revision, which was unusual. She was paying very close attention. He had felt very briefly the specific pride of a craftsman who has built something well. Yujiro entered through the river gate at mid-morning, and the gate guards did not stop him. Qyburn watched this from the window of a requisitioned building 2 streets in, where he had positioned himself with a clear angle on 3 approach vectors. He watched the guards clock the figure's approach, assess, and find something in that assessment that produced inaction. Not cowardice exactly. He had seen cowardice often enough to distinguish it. This was closer to the response of a body that had registered a category of threat that its training had not covered and had defaulted to stillness, while it consulted an instinct that never arrived. The first Scorpion fired at 40 yards. Qyburn saw it happen, the operator pulling the release, the bolt clearing the emplacement at the trajectory they had tested, and he saw in the same moment Yujiro step left by approximately 18 inches. Not a dive, not a roll. A step timed to the noise of the mechanism, rather than the sight of the bolt, the body moving before the projectile had fully left the groove. The bolt struck the wall of a building behind him and embedded 6 inches into the stone. Qyburn made a note. He had calibrated the Scorpions for a target that would react to visual threat cues. He had not accounted for a target that reacted to mechanical sound. He revised the notation, reacts to mechanism, not projectile. Recalibrate trigger sequence. The information was interesting. It was also no longer actionable. The second scorpion fired at 25 yards from an angle perpendicular to the first. This was the configuration he had been most confident in. Two simultaneous vectors prevented a single lateral step from clearing both. He watched Yujiro move into the interior angle between the two firing lines, rather than away from either closing distance on the second emplacement, in the time it took the operator to consider whether to abandon the mechanism and draw a sword. The operator chose the sword. That decision cost him 4 seconds and the structural integrity of his right shoulder. The scorpion was not fired again. By the time the Golden Company's first choke point engaged, the street behind Yujiro held 2 non-functional scorpion emplacements and 11 men who had made various decisions about whether to remain standing, all of whom had reached the same conclusion. None. The compression corridor failed at the second choke point. Qyburn had arranged the company in groups of 12 each group, occupying a width of street that a single fighter could not clear without engaging at least 4 soldiers simultaneously. The configuration had worked against every threat model he had run it against. What he had not modeled was a target that did not attempt to clear the width simultaneously, but instead found the pivot point of the formation, the single soldier whose position was load-bearing for the geometry of the whole, and removed that soldier first. He watched it from the roof of a building overlooking the second choke point. The formation compressed as designed. Yujiro did not engage the front. He stood at the edge of engagement range, and he was still. And then he was not still. And the load-bearing soldier, a man named Edwick Qyburn, would learn later a veteran of the disputed lands, went down, and the formation's right flank lost its anchor. And what followed was not a fight, so much as a geometric problem whose solution had been removed. The wildfire in the third approach triggered early. This was not Yujiro's doing and was not Cersei's order. It was a soldier at the liver whose hands were shaking the cache closest to the second choke point 20 feet below the flagstones of Copper Street. The trigger pulled at the wrong moment. The flame propagated through the channel faster than the design allowed, and the result was a section of Copper Street, becoming briefly a furnace that consumed 7 Golden Company soldiers, 2 buildings whose lower floors had been used for the lever mechanism and the approach geometry that the cache had been placed to defend. Qyburn watched the green tinge in the smoke and made a final notation in the record he was keeping. System integrity failed at Cascade Point. Cause human variable introduced at stress moment. Recommendation unapplicable. He closed the record and set it on the windowsill. He was still there when the screaming from the keep began. He did not go to it. He had understood somewhere in the middle of watching the second choke point dissolve that the keep was the end of a sequence he no longer had the ability to alter. Cersei had 3 more contingencies. That he knew of Gregor Clegane, a secondary scorpion mounted in the throne room corridor, and a lever beneath the map table connected to the deepest wildfire cache in the cellars. He had designed all of them. He did not know which he had deployed or in which order. What he knew from the screaming's quality and duration was the outcome. He sat with his record and his window for a long time after the screaming stopped. Below, the street was empty, in the specific way streets went empty when the people in them had reached a collective understanding that being outside was no longer a viable option. A gold cloak ran past at speed, helmet gone in the direction away from the keep. Then another. Then a group of 3 not running, walking fast, already shedding the crimson of their cloaks as they moved. The city's loyalty was a system like everything else. Systems had thresholds. After a while, he picked up his record again, turned to a new page, and wrote 4 words at the top. He is still alive. He considered them for a moment, then added 3 more. I was thorough. He put the record away, stood, looked at the window and the empty street below. and the faint green tinge still present in the smoke rising from the direction of Copper Street, and he walked to the door. He left the building without looking back at the window, which was, he reflected, the only honest response to a result he had not found a way to prepare for. The ravens came in wrong order, which was how Tyrion knew the world had already changed before he had finished processing that it was changing. He was in the small council chamber, the one off the throne room, the room that had housed every administrative decision of consequence for 3 centuries. The room whose walls had absorbed the particular smell of candle wax, an old ambition, when the first bird arrived from Casterly Rock. Then, one from Highgarden addressed to no one its message. 3 lines and a seal that had been hastily pressed. Then the raven from White Harbor, the one from Gulltown, the one from Old Town, that arrived with its leg band torn and its feathers singed at the tips from something it had flown through to reach the capital. He read them in the order they arrived. The Reach Lords were already in correspondence with each other. The phrasing of the Highgarden message made that clear, the exact cadence of men who had been talking before they wrote. The Vale was asking questions rather than issuing statements, which meant Lord Royce was still deciding something, and had not yet decided what. Dorne had sent nothing, which was its own kind of message. The Iron Islands had sent a message whose subtext was so transparent it was barely subtext. If the throne is empty, we would like to discuss certain agreements previously made. He set them in a line on the table. The North had not sent anything. He had expected this. He had in fact expected it before anything else happened, because he had met Sansa Stark and had understood very clearly that she had been waiting for a reason to close the border that Westeros would accept, and that she was not going to announce the decision. She was going to make it, and then it would simply be made. Jon arrived while he was still reading. He came in without knocking, which was new, or perhaps not new. Perhaps Jon had simply stopped performing the formalities that he had never fully believed in, and that had never been fully natural on him. "How many?" Jon asked, looking at the line of ravens. "More than yesterday. Fewer than tomorrow." Tyrion gestured at the chair across the table. "Sit if you want. There's nothing useful we can do for the next hour, except understand the shape of what's happening." Jon sat. He looked at the ravens without touching them. "Where is he?" "The throne room, last I heard. He's been in there for some time." Tyrion picked up the message from the Iron Islands and turned it over. "No one has gone in." "Because he's there. Because he's there." The throne room was empty of everyone except Yujiro. Tyrion had been in the throne room many times, had stood in its shadow and its echo and its particular quality of cold that it produced regardless of the season, and he had always found it large. It was a large room. That had always been part of the point. A room large enough that the distance between the door and the throne communicated something about the nature of authority before a single word was spoken. With only one person in it, it was very large indeed. Yujiro was standing in front of the Iron Throne, not on the dais. At the base of it, close enough to touch, looking up at it with the expression, the quality of attention he brought to everything he examined. The throne was approximately what it always was. A mass of melted swords fused into a shape that suggested a seat without being particularly comfortable, as one ugly in the specific way of things that were never meant to be beautiful, but only meant to communicate something about the person who had made them. Yujiro reached out and put his hand on one of the lower sword hilts. He pressed. The metal did not give. He moved his hand to a different point, tested the weld there, the integrity of the join. A craftsman checking materials. He had the look of someone who had heard a great deal about an object and was now determining how the reality compared to the report. Tyrion walked forward until he was perhaps 15 feet behind him. He stopped there. He had learned something about the appropriate distance to stand from Yujiro, which was slightly farther than felt natural and somewhat closer than felt safe. "Well," Tyrion said. Yujiro did not turn. A lot of swords. Yes, that's more or less what it is. Men died for this. Men have died for considerably less impressive objects. At least this one has a certain... He searched for the word ambition. Yujiro withdrew his hand and looked at it briefly. The same gesture Tyrion had seen him make in the Godswood after the fight with the White Walkers, checking the hand, checking what the material had communicated to it. He turned then and looked at Tyrion with the assessment that Tyrion had come to understand as the neutral baseline of how Yujiro looked at everything. "Your queen is dead," Yujiro said. "My queen has been dead for some time in various senses." He kept his voice even. "You mean Cersei? The one who built the traps?" "Yes. She was good at that. She was..." Yujiro agreed, and there was something in the word that was not admiration and was not dismissal. A flat acknowledgement of competence, the way you acknowledged a lock that had been well made before you broke it. Better than most. She understood her tools. The tools didn't hold. No tool does against the wrong problem. He looked back at the throne for a moment. "She thought I was a siege. You besiege things by cutting supply lines, by wearing down will, by making the cost of resistance exceed the cost of surrender." A pause. "I don't surrender." So the model was wrong at the foundation. Tyrion looked at the throne, then at Yujiro, then at the throne again. He had spent a considerable portion of his life thinking about power, its sources, its expressions, its limits. And he was looking at something that had just demonstrated in the course of 2 months and 2 very different battles, that the entire architecture of power he had studied and navigated and occasionally wielded was built on a material he had not previously identified as a variable. "What will you do now?" he asked. Yujiro's attention moved from the throne. It moved to the windows. The high windows that looked south and east over a city that was quieter than it should have been, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a thing that has lost its organizing principle and has not yet found a replacement. There's an ocean east of here. Several, depending on how you count them. And past them, Essos, cities, empires, wars that have been running longer than the ones here. He paused. People who have never heard of the Iron Throne. Yujiro turned that over. "Good." He moved toward the door, and Tyrion stepped aside because it was either that or be moved, and he had learned enough to know the difference. "You broke something," Tyrion said to his back. "I want you to know that. Whatever comes next, it won't be what was here before." Yujiro stopped. Not for long. Long enough. "What was here before was already broken," he said. "You just couldn't see the crack." He walked out of the throne room without looking back at the throne, and his footsteps in the corridor were even and unhurried and grew quieter, and then stopped being audible at all. Tyrion stood alone in the throne room for some time. He went back to the small council chamber and read the remaining ravens. The Reach Lords had reached a preliminary agreement among themselves. The Vale had stopped asking questions and started issuing statements. Dorne had sent a message finally, brief watching. Riverland's lords were demanding arbitration from a capital that no longer had an obvious authority to provide it, which was the administrative disaster he had always known was one bad season away. He found a blank piece of parchment and a quill. He wrote for an hour, not orders, because he had no authority to issue orders, but the kind of letters that carried information, and occasionally carried suggestion, and left room for the recipient to believe the suggestion had been their own idea. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. It was the skill that had kept him alive through every regime change he had survived, and he had survived several. When he finished, he set the letters in order by urgency and called for a raven keeper. While he waited, he looked at the window. The smoke from the Copper Street quarter had thinned. The harbor was visible from this angle on clear days, and today was nearly clear, and he could see two ships that were not there yesterday. Traders probably come to assess what King's Landing was now worth to them. Commerce moved faster than armies. It always had. What was here before was already broken. The sentence sat in his head without moving. The throne was standing empty in the next room. Not because it had been destroyed, because the people who would have come for it were currently writing letters to each other, weighing the cost against the benefit, and that calculation was taking longer than it used to. Belief, it turned out, was not a renewable resource. Once a thing was proved to be less permanent than the people depending on it required, you could not simply restore it by insisting. You had to wait for the generation that had not seen the proof. The Raven Keeper arrived. Tyrion handed over the letters and gave the destinations. He watched the keeper go. Then he poured himself a measure of wine, a small one, because the day had more hours in it, and the hours were going to require whatever clarity he could preserve, and turned back to the window. Somewhere in the harbor, a ship was moving. Eastward, which was unusual for this time of year. He watched it clear the harbor mouth, its sails catching the morning wind, growing smaller as it found the channel. He watched until it was gone. Behind him on the table, the ravens sat in their line, waiting. The city outside was already relearning how to make noise, the low grinding noise of people who had survived something and were now re-entering the business of being alive, which was always louder and messier and more persistent than the things that tried to stop it. The Iron Throne stood empty in the next room. It would not stand empty for long. That was not how thrones worked, or cities, or the human instinct that looked at a power vacuum and began calculating. Someone would come. Several someones would come, probably simultaneously, which was how the next war would start, and the war after that. Tyrion picked up his wine and took a small, considered sip. In the harbor, the ship was gone. On the road east from the city gate, he could just see it from this angle. If he leaned, a figure was visible. Red hair, moving at a pace that did not vary. Already past the point where the road curved and the city lost sight of it. He watched until that too was gone. Then he turned back to the table, pulled a fresh parchment toward him, and began.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.